great that you're all here so early this morning. It'll be interesting to see who shows up tomorrow morning as this conference goes on. But this is a great opportunity because we have a fantastic panel here, Canadian, American, British, German, very international panel, because of course our subject is international co-production. And although technically, as you know, we don't have a treaty with the US, I still think of those as international co-productions. We're going to get into a lot of the detail today about how these productions come together from a creative perspective, a financing perspective, a distribution perspective. As you know, what happened in the film industry, many of you are independent film producers, is now happening in the television industry. In the feature film industry, there was a time, of course, where the studios were developing, financing, producing, distributing movies. And over time, they've really retreated to mostly be distributors. And most of the feature films being made today are being financed through many unusual independent methods of partnerships between different countries, equity funds, and various forms of tax credits and soft costs. Well, the same thing, of course, has happened now in the television industry. There are still, of course, studios in Los Angeles that make most of the television shows for the networks. But with the proliferation of all of the new cable channels and over-the-top channels, and of course the additional channels that are emerging in Europe and all the European countries, they're no longer just 2 or 3 channels the way there used to be. There's now emerged this great, wonderful world of independent television. And Canada has a very unique position in this world because, of course, we do have these treaties with 55 countries all over the world, which allows us to work in a wonderful way to combine both talent and tax incentives, et cetera. And, of course, Canadians have a North American sensibility, which many of the European and even the English are looking for in terms of how we approach making television and providing this kind of content to the world. So we want to make this session somewhat interactive. So rather than just wait for questions at the very end of the session, if people have something that, because there's a lot we're going to cover that they want to ask about, please raise your hand. I assume there might be microphones out there, or speak loudly, because we really do want to make sure that this panel addresses the questions you have about this world and what's going on. So I think we're going to begin in Canada with Susan Alexander, who is a production executive at Shaw Media. And she's going to tell us a little bit about Shaw, what Shaw is doing in terms of both their traditional Canadian television model and then also how they approach thinking about and participating in co-productions.
Hi. So Shaw Media has 20-odd channels. We have dramatic channels, we have lifestyle, we have reality, and we have documentary channels. So we have, obviously we do acquisitions. We air on Global, our main network, a lot of American series. We also make a lot of wonderful Canadian series. But we also look for opportunities to broaden our audience viewership, or broaden our audience viewer experience with international co-productions and with co-ventures with the States. I have a cheat sheet because we have a lot of shows. Right now in production we have 8 dramas and a comedy. We have an MOW. We basically program dramas mostly for Global, which is our network, Showcase, which is its cable sister, and we're starting to do a little bit more with history. 6 of those shows are funded by the Canadian Media Fund, so they're Canadian shows. One of those also has an American broadcast partner, which is ABC and Rookie Blue. We have 4 shows currently that we're doing as Canadian shows, but also with U.S. partners, and 3 of those are what we call 6 out of 10 shows. Those are Copper, Haven, which we do together, and another show called Beauty and the Beast. And we value those relationships very much. It's really fun to work on those. And we have 2 international co-productions right now. We have Vikings, which is a great, it came together with History US and History Canada, who share a brand, so it was an obvious fit to do that show for those, and it's been a huge success. And Continuum, which is a UK-Canada co-production, which airs on Showcase. So we do a whole bunch of different stuff.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And just, can you explain briefly how some of the financing is approached in terms of what a CMF show means?
Absolutely.
Versus a 6 out of 10 versus an international treaty co-pro?
Absolutely. In Canada, we have a wonderful government fund called the Canadian Media Fund, and all the networks have an envelope. So we have an envelope that we spend every year on new and returning Canadian series. And those are Canadian written, Canadian developed, Canadian produced. So examples of that are Rookie Blue, Bomb Girls, Lost Girl. We've just commissioned 2 new ones, Remedy, and a comedy called Working the Angles. And so those are 100% CMF. But under the CMF envelope, we can also do international co-productions because they count for us as Canadian.
Right. So a 10 out of 10 CMF show can more or less be fully financed in Canada.
Yeah.
Because you're getting the license fee from the broadcaster for Canadian content.
Right.
And then on top of that, you're being given this additional top-up license fee.
Yep.
From the CMF, which will usually get you to 80, well, with the tax credits, to 85, 90%.
Yeah, and then the onus is on the producer to go out and find the rest of that
Correct.
money.
So that's really been the model for Canadian network television for many, many years.
Yep.
With the help of the CMF.
Right.
Then with a 6 out of 10 show, there is no CMF available.
Right.
So you're only going to get a license fee.
Right, and the reason there might not be any CMF available for 6 out of 10 show is if the writer's not Canadian, or if it's been brought to us, it still has to have a Canadian production partner.
Correct.
It still has to be a producer involved, but it may be, they may be working with an American producer, like in Haven, for instance. It's an American-Canadian co-producing entity, and so they've come together and got an American broadcaster and a Canadian broadcaster to work together to
So
produce the series.
75% of the budget still needs to be spent in Canada, but 25% can be spent on American elements,
Right.
which then often provides attractiveness to the U.S. networks, who will then make up, ideally, the additional license fee
Right.
that you weren't getting from the CMF.
Yeah, it's kind of a win-win for both broadcasters
Correct.
because more money gets to be brought to the table.
Right.
You can, a large talent pool, an international talent pool can be brought together. It's just a different type of programming.
And then in the third version, the international treaty co-pro,
Right.
the show is still considered Canadian content as long as you qualify for the treaty, which means a minimum of 20% of the budget and the financing comes from the minority country. So this is a great opportunity, again, for Canadian networks to participate in very large shows. You know, some of these, like the Vikings
is a
and
good
Tudors,
example.
$4 or $5 million an hour shows, where they're still paying the same license fee that they're paying for a $2 million Canadian show, or a 6 out of 10, and then they still have these much bigger budgeted shows.
Yeah, and quite
So-
often those are the big event shows.
Right, so that obviously is a very attractive model as well. And so most of the networks, including, you know, Bell and everyone else, are looking at having this kind of portfolio of 10 out of 10 Canadian shows, 6 out of 10 shows, and these treaty co-productions.
Right.
But we'll get into more detail about that later. So next, I think we'll talk a little with Sean Pillar, who has his own production company in the U.S. with his partners. Traditionally, as you know, most of these showrunner, writer, producer, what else, actor? No?
No.
Okay.
Thank you.
But everything
Thank
else.
God. No.
And his perspective on working in Canada and working in this new non-studio network model. And so, Sean, tell us a little bit about how you got into this and how this, and some of the shows that you've been doing.
Let's see. I've been doing this, wow. I graduated film school in 95. I started doing, my first TV series we shot in Vancouver was called The Dead Zone, which is a Stephen King series, and I kind of really haven't stopped. We did 5 years in Vancouver, then moved it to Montreal, and then now we're doing Haven, and we're finishing our fourth season right now.
But Dead Zone, you were just doing service work in Canada.
Correct. It was Paramount and Lionsgate. It was one of Lionsgate's first series, who used to be more of a full Canadian company, and they bridged over. But we didn't tap into any of the tax credits, but it did have a big international presence in terms of distribution and international. And it was a different time because the tax credits were, the exchange rate was very different. I was joking at the table saying just the per diem you would get being on location, I would buy 10 pairs of shoes every week because the Canadian dollar was weaker at the time, and now it's 50-50. So, as a producer, you develop scripts and you come up with ideas, and really you just want to make it. And so where are you going to go to that fits the creative vision of the show? And where do you go to, who are the salespeople and partners that believe in that vision? And so you really want to give yourself the best shot to make a product that's going to sell and be found by fans. So Haven was a perfect example of why doing an international co-production and between U.S. and Canada. Stephen King, all of his shows are set in Maine, so cut to Chester, Nova Scotia. So we work with E1 is our studio on this project, and it's a co-production between Pillar, Seek, and Shepherd and E1. It was an interesting model. It was one of the early sort of straight-to-series models, and we actually sold to Roma Khan, and who's now at MGM, which we're doing another Stephen King show with her, but she was head of NBC International Sci-Fi. We actually first sold the show to ABC Domestic, and it got into the sort of development hell, and everyone there got fired, and we got the script back, and then we said, let's not do this the traditional way. Let's go, act like independent filmmakers and sell it internationally first. So we took it to London, and we sold it to Sci-Fi, and then we talked to my sister over here, and she was in, and we then needed to find a domestic partner. We had Stephen King, we had us who had done the Dead Zone, we had some other elements in the writers, and we sort of set it out and had a little bidding war in LA, and Sci-Fi Domestic picked it up. And ironically, international and domestic sci-fi had actually never worked together before. And I was like, they didn't even know each other, really. So it became this very synergistic project, and then we sort of scouted and picked Nova Scotia to shoot. And it's been a real entertaining learning experience for me from, creatively talking about casting and meeting, bringing in international casting actors, and getting access to casting agents that we would have never, met because of our different partners and different networks. And our studio is very, is E1 does basically distributes like every film in Canada pretty much now. Their burgeoning TV business is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So Haven was really the launching pad for that, one of their, their first flagship show that started to go big internationally. And it was fun and exciting to be there at that time. When they were just getting started and going to MIPCOM and learning about the international market and figuring out ways that could help me tell stories and sort of expand our brand. So now we have Sci-Fi, channel Chile and Sci-Fi channel Italy. So I get all these tweets from people I can't understand what they're saying, but I know they're watching the show, which is exciting.
So, again, what Sean's experience is interesting because I think the first show we did up here was a service production. So he wasn't coming here as Canadian content. He wasn't coming here to, but it was really just to take advantage of the low-cost production and the tax credits. And as you know, Canada was a great place for service production for many years. And it wasn't that it was because they were getting great deals with Canadian networks or necessarily even selling the shows to Canadian networks. It was just for production service. But that's actually had an enormous benefit for our entire, ecosystem because, of course, all the crews, actors, directors got a tremendous experience doing all of those service shows. So they were working now on the 10 out of 10 old, the Canadian content shows, but working on these service shows really helped, at least in my opinion, raise the bar and the skill set of these craftsmen of the cameramen and everybody. So it began to be that you no longer could tell when something was a Canadian show.
Yep.
Because they were now starting to look as good and because the experience had been developed. So then when it was time and people started to understand this idea that if you could qualify a show as Canadian content by making it a 6 out of 10, which still means you can have an American showrunner, an American star, but now because it's qualified Canadian content, the Canadian network will pay an enhanced license fee. So Canadian networks pay a certain amount of money when they simply acquire an American television show, but that's a lower number than they'll pay for a Canadian content qualified show because they all have a condition of license to spend X amount of money each year on Canadian content. And that difference can be quite substantial.
Absolutely.
What would you, Susan, say the range between an acquisition show versus a Canadian content per hour for a, there's a range.
It ranges so much, it's hard to say.
All I can tell you is you want your show to qualify
It does
Canadian.
range a lot.
It makes a big difference because, again, just in terms of volume, there are many shows Canadian networks can acquire. All the shows being done by all the networks. If you can bring them a quality show that also qualifies Canadian content, it's much more likely they will buy it with this enhanced fee. So we're now seeing American producers and even American studios going out of their way to ensure that their shows, instead of just being serviced in Canada, actually can qualify Canadian content because then they have access to the enhanced license fee. And also, the tax credit is slightly higher when you are a Canadian content show versus just a service show.
But it's also smart, I think it's smart, we feel it's smart, that to have it be, having a show spread the risk around. So you've got Europe in, you've got Canada in, you've got the United States in. So we're basically, I like to joke, our shows are kind of impossible to cancel because they're so cheap and good.
But that's a very, that's a very good point.
And basically, sci-fi domestic would normally spend $1 million minimum to
Correct.
2.5 to $3 million or $4 million sometimes for a show that they distribute and own. And if it tanks,
Right.
you're screwed.
That's
And
right.
people get fired. In our case, they're spending 550, whatever, I don't know what it's up to now, 500 grand a year. So they're spending, 1/10 of what they would spend on a show that they own, but and Europe is spending the same, and Canada spends the same. So we take
We
that,
spend
put it
less,
together.
actually.
Yeah,
Yes, less.
and then we add that up with the tax credit we get from doing basically 6 out of 10.
Correct.
And shoot it in Chester, Nova Scotia, and we get an extra 65%. You put all that together, we've got a really nice budget.
That's right.
And the ratings are good, the show looks fantastic, and it really makes, hopefully, the show hard to cancel.
So again, that's this kind of new complex world of independent television financing. There's nothing wrong, of course, with doing 10 out of 10 shows that the networks will primarily finance using the CMF,
Yeah.
but there's limitations to how much CMF money they have as well. So they can only do so many of those shows.
And I mean, CMF shows can be much more expensive because we take all the breakage on the actors and things like that, whereas, as Sean said, we're sharing the risk on a show where there are other partners involved.
So as a producer, if you can, you really should be looking at these different alternatives because you want to make it as attractive as possible for the Canadian network to come on board and help finance your show. So let's move on a little to the other side of the ocean, and Justin Thompson Glover, who's the executive producer, co-chairman of Far More Media, who's been involved in a number of traditional UK shows, but also has become very involved in this world of co-production and packaging and financing shows. And maybe you can talk about some of your experiences with Combat Hospital and Thorn and different shows that you're doing, both with Canada and outside.
Yes. From the UK perspective, what we try and do at Far More is try and get hold of projects which are going to be fantastically good. That's mostly what we try to do. The issue for us is trying traditionally, the BBC and ITV would pick up sort of 90%, 95% of the budget, and it was quite easy. You would go across the road to BBC Worldwide,
Yep.
and they would give you the balance, and then you'd make it. What's happened since, which is good and bad, because there are great opportunities and more ambition, is they're only giving you 60% or 50% and 40%. Now, for a lot of producers, that's a disaster, because you have no idea how to put that together. Because you walk across the road to BBC Worldwide and say, we've got 60% gap, could you give it to us? And they go, no. And then you're sort of stuck. So that's the issue which I think a lot of producers have been finding that an issue. So we have, over the last about 12, 15 years, we've in fact been doing a lot of work internationally. Right at the start, we did our first UK-Canadian co-production called DICE. And the reason we got involved was because that was when the UK had the sale and lease back. And people used to come and see us because we had something to offer. Unfortunately, just as we started doing that, they cancelled the sale and lease back, which meant we had nothing to offer, which meant nobody came to see us. So we tried to look at other ways of putting things together. So over the last about 10 years, we've I think done 12 UK-Canadian co-productions, which I think is more than anybody else.
Probably.
And what we do is we develop our own shows, and we also work with UK writers, UK production companies to try and find the gap, 50%, the 60%. And that is lots of different models you look at. Now, if you, in the UK, if you're developing a show which is about a Manchester chimney sweep, it's not going to sell, possibly. Although they're, with some fantastical elements maybe, but so you tend to have two different ways of doing it. If it's a very indigenous project which has got no real chance of selling, you've got to have real expectations about what you're trying to do. But if, however, it's a show which has potential, we're just putting together something called Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which is based on a brilliant a sort of door-stopping book. And it's although it's period, which sometimes people get nervous about, the great thing that's now becoming better, it's got a great sort of fantastical nature. It's about magic. In fact, the pitch is a Harry Potter for adults, which is, amazingly people came on board for that. And how you did on that one is because it had fantasy and it was a subject which everybody was looking for. You could actually, I think that the UK is putting about 40% up, and we're bringing the rest of the budget from other sources. And that, as I'm sure we'll go on to talk about, will have huge sort of impact about what people's views are in Canada, in America, internationally, what the script is, the script notes, the casting. It's a sort of minefield, which when you start a project, right from the beginning, you know where you are potentially going to get blown up. And I think it's all about navigating your way through the potential problems which are going to surface. And at least if you know what those problems are internationally, there is a chance it might work. But that's sort of the job of the producer, which is becoming more and more so in this quite sort of new market.
Yeah, and we will get to this issue of how to creatively you actually make these shows, because that's a whole, right now we're talking more about the financing and packaging of it, but I think we're going to get to that whole process in terms of creative decision making and everything else. So for the UK, this, as Justin, is a very important part now of their marketplace, because of the fact that the license fees are basically no longer there to fully finance. And the challenge, of course, is the networks are slowly coming along to this idea. I think in Canada, we've seen a more openness to this type of structure and getting right to series and co-production. What is the attitude at the networks in Canada about this kind of model?
In the UK?
In the UK,
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
There is, traditionally, not many British broadcasters here, so I can say this. But there is traditionally there has been a slight arrogance. Is probably too small a word. They don't like co-production necessarily. We are the BBC is a classic sort of phrase. However, what's been fantastic is the ambition of the broadcasters now is up there. They want the big shows, and they know that it's probably a necessary evil. That's how they perceive co-production. As long as you don't talk about it too much openly, they will accept it. And that's sort of it. There's got to be a sleight of hand. So, they may not necessarily... There was a great just project on this. They've got much better, but there was a great project which we did with Kathleen called Crimson Petal and the White, which was a wonderful sort of a 19th century story about a rather wicked prostitute called Sugar. It was a great story. And we almost had to pretend to the BBC that it wasn't really happening. But we delivered on it, and Canada, it was fantastic.
Because it was a co-production with Canada, with
UK-Canadian co-production.
TMN and Movie Central?
Exactly, TMN and Movie Central. And we got a significant amount of money. Now, the Canadian partner were brilliant and very supportive and knew exactly how co-production should work. The BBC now are changing.
Yes.
They are all changing, and there's a huge amount of difference. One further thing, which is fantastic, traditionally we didn't have anything to offer. Now we've just set this UK tax credit up, so there is much more material now coming into the UK, and broadcasters are also aware of that, and there are partnership opportunities there, which it's quite an exciting time at the moment.
Yeah, no, I think there will be a change. There's no question it is changing. So anyhow, thank you. So now we'll move on to Taja Abel, who's the Vice President of ZDF Enterprise Drama, which is a distribution company that works as well with ZDF channels, etc. And of course, in Germany and in other European countries, co-production is something that has existed for a long time because, of course, their markets are relatively smaller. So it was always a tradition for French, Italian, German, Scandinavian countries to pool their resources to make higher level drama. And perhaps maybe that's made it a little easier, or why don't you tell us a little bit about the point of view of your company and some of the non-English speaking countries to this world of co-production?
Hi, ZDF Enterprises is a part of the ZDF group, and ZDF is one and two public broadcasters in Germany. ZDF has one main channel and three smaller digital channels. As a subsidiary of ZDF, our history in co-production derives a lot from the co-production projects that we did with ZDF. ZDF has a long tradition of doing Scandinavian co-production in the crime genre. So with our Scandinavian partners, we did series like The Bridge or The Killing, which are currently being remade or already remade in the US. A number of the co-productions we did in Europe probably comes, especially the ones with Scandinavia, from a certain closeness in a cultural sense. So Germans and Scandinavians, we like to say we share the same kind of depression. The weather is bad, the alcohol cheap, so there is this there is just a certain fit, also because Germany is a crime-loving nation, and Scandinavia has a lot of very good, outstanding crime novelists.
Yep.
So we had a property that would work in the German-speaking world, and other territories that were close to us. From there, ZDF has always been and is involved in also a couple of international event productions. One example for that is the European version of Borgias. We at ZDF Enterprises are currently developing 2 projects with Michael Hurst. How we work, we as ZDF Enterprises work with ZDF, we look together for projects that might fit the channel. The channel has a co-production slot that is focused on the crime genre and some other opportunities to co-produce internationally. As a distributor, we also look for content that could fit to other international broadcasters, to other partners in the German-speaking world. So there we are a bit wider in the types of genre we look for. And of course, English-speaking content is for us also a very important part of our catalog. We oversee at ZDF Enterprises holding of production companies, and we work with international producers over development agreements or first look deals. We are currently developing a project with BBC Scotland, and have some of our Scandinavian writers that we are co-developing something.
So how do you look at your network and your audience as well at the issue of language? Because I assume that traditionally most of the shows were in German language and produced in German language. Now that's changed, yes? And how does the audience feel? I mean, now you're making English language shows.
That is a big difference from the perspective of the broadcaster and
Right.
from the perspective of us as a
Right.
distributor, because in Germany and also in France, Italy, Spain, programs are dubbed, most
Correct.
of them. So for Germans, it doesn't really make a difference apart from a different cast
Right.
where that show comes from. That leads when you then talk with international partners about different accents in a show or why someone
You don't
would
care.
talk that way, we wouldn't know.
Or care, because you're going to dub it anyhow. Yeah.
Yes. So that is why maybe also some criteria like a German cast
Right.
or something like that is
Right.
not that important for the broadcaster. For us as a distributor, the language issue is a lot more important.
Correct.
Because not all countries dub. The English language gives us a whole new international possibility
Value,
to
yeah.
distribute. It is very. If I would sit on this panel 5 years
Yeah.
ago, I would have said there is just no way to distribute to English-speaking countries in other languages subtitled.
Yep.
That was before The Killing and The Bridge became really successful in the UK, and we also in some parts of the US for some platforms. So that's a new thing, even though it's probably highly unlikely that subtitled Danish content will ever be prime time on BBC or ABC.
Yeah. But you understand, this is very interesting, and as a English language producer, I didn't quite understand until I started doing some co-productions, is that in these foreign language European countries, of course, there's always been their local drama made in German or French or Italian, but a great deal of their shows were, of course, American shows that were dubbed. So the biggest show in Germany was not a German, drama, it was Dr. House, right? So the audiences became quite used to watching dubbed television shows. So when we now went to start to make English language television shows that were now being commissioned by German networks or French networks or Italian networks, it seemed quite strange to me. Here would be these countries, these networks that would commission shows they knew they were going to dub before they even put them on the air. So, but they're all quite interested in doing that now. And there seems to be no resistance. In fact, they're quite anxious to be involved in that because, of course, if they're distributors as well, as your company is, then they have product to distribute in the English language, which has more value than perhaps the German language drama series that you might have had otherwise. So I think that's also just one of the phenomenons that sort of has cultivated more and more opportunity in the treaty co-production world, is this willingness for the European countries to all commission and work in English. And of course, not unlike in Canada and in the UK, if a network is involved in commissioning a show, they're going to pay a much higher license fee than they would just as an acquisition. Can you speak a little to how that works?
Yes. In the UK, quite often we will be brought fantastic scripts. I remember once there was a really good script by the writers. I won't go into it, but a really good script, Oscar-nominated writers, and it was a Dickens classic. It was what I thought. This was about 8 years ago. I thought it was an absolute sort of slam dunk for a BBC One to come on board. They looked at it and said it's really good, but no. Then about 2 years later, they sort of made a similar version themselves, and it was terrible, and it had a terrible script. And there was a brilliant one beforehand. The reason for this is that in the UK, they are very nervous about being given scripts because they have no ownership feeling of the project. They want to develop it. They want to put their feelings into notes about it. So there's one situation which I've got where, although I've got a very good script, if I want to go back into the UK, I've almost got to either say there isn't a script or show them the script, get it rewritten. It might end up being exactly the same, but that will allow the broadcaster to feel they have some ownership of that. And the difference is there's hardly any, if you get an acquisition price from the UK,
Right.
The acquisition price is one, there is hardly any acquisition in the UK, like as we know, in the BBC budget is about 2% acquisition, it's hardly anything. If you do, it will be like £25,000 an hour. If you play your cards right and they develop it, you could get 900,000, £1 million. So it's to be very careful how you approach the BBC or the ITV Channel 4 Sky. Get them involved early, otherwise they won't give you anything.
And is that true in Germany and some of the difference between a commission versus an acquisition in terms of license fee?
Yes, I'd say that there are three kinds.
Okay.
One is the acquisition, the other one is the pre-buy co-production,
Right.
and then the commission.
Right.
Maybe an important thing to say about ZDF, but that also holds for other broadcasters in Germany, is ZDF has a defined co-production acquisition slot, and for that they have a certain commissioning
License,
capacity.
yeah.
So the commissioning power and the decision right is at ZDF, but I would always advise producers against trying to go there and say, tell me what you want and I'll make it, or we have this idea, do you want to develop the script with us? Because they don't have the capacity for that. That is not what they want. They are looking for things where they can get involved creatively.
Right.
To
have
a
other
certain
partners
extent,
already,
and depending on that extent, it's an acquisition or a co-production. But they don't want and can't develop projects. So in that case, it would actually be better to come to ZDF with a script.
And that's interesting in terms of Shaw. I'd like you to comment on that, because sometimes as a Canadian producer, you might have a big idea for a wonderful international co-pro, $4 or $5 million an hour. Is that something you can start with and just go to a Canadian network and say, will you pay for all the development for this? How does Shaw think about those projects when they come to you?
You know, again, it depends on the project. I think that certainly with the, you want your broadcaster in early because our license fee triggers a lot of other government funding in these international co-productions or Canadian shows. Not the same in the American-Canadian model.
Right.
And so in that case, quite often, we're not first in.
Right.
Because to be first in, we need a real Canadian element. And the Canadian, even though there would be obviously a Canadian producer attached, it might be something that is brought to us when there's already an American partner involved.
Because you know you would not be able to make it unless there was an American partner, so why even start? Because it might be too hard later.
Right.
And that might also be true with the international co-productions, that,
Right.
you know, again, if you're, as a Canadian network, only going to be a piece of the financing, to spend a lot of money developing a project that then you just have to hope the producer's able to put everything else together is probably not the wisest use of your money.
No, but sometimes these are a very good deal for us.
That's right, but it helps if you have,
Yeah.
if the producer has some other partner involved already, either in the US version or European, or a big distribution company or someone else who even is sharing development costs. So you can begin to imagine the likelihood of it happening is much better than if it's just something the poor Canadian network's going to do all by itself, which they can't really fund these big shows that way.
Yeah.
So we don't have too much more time, but I think it's very important now to talk a little bit about the creative process as well, because I think you're starting to get a picture of why it's a very good thing for these all of Canadian producers, for the networks to now be very involved in this independent treaty co-production, you know, U.S. co-venture structures, but that doesn't necessarily, for financial reasons, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to all be easy, because the creative process can be very complicated, because of course now it's hard enough when you just have one network trying to tell you what to do all the time. Imagine when you have 2, 3, or 4 networks telling you what to do. So why don't we talk a little bit about what that process is, and Sean, why don't you start to talk about that, because as a showrunner, creative person.
But she's right there. She can hear me.
I know. I forgot about.
No, actually, it's interesting. You kind of set up a show. You know, you start with the creative, but you can't make it unless you have the financing, and you have to. So it becomes this balance. And what I was saying about, you know, our shows being tough to cancel is a really smart thing, because you get to spread the risk. But with that comes other voices and other agendas and other priorities. And there's pluses and minuses to that. Sometimes last year, the UK, or Sci-Fi International, paid for this really cool promo because they wanted it for their air. And they said, but the US can't use it. And I was like, but I'm directing it, it's gonna be great, it's gonna be this whole thing. And they were like, nope, it's ours, we're paying for it. And of course, I sent it to the US people anyways, and just let them. I was like, well, you didn't get this for me, and it kind of ran on the internet kind of thing. But it was really fun. It's on YouTube. So they sort of have their own agenda and their own budget. And they have their own audience they're trying to appeal to. Sometimes it's a younger audience. Sometimes they want to, you know, recommend we get, you know, a couple of British actors in there, or, you know, to appeal to their international channels or markets, and which is fine. And as a producer, you want to. These are the people that become your friends. They become extended family. But really, they all have skin in the game, that they really want to make the show succeed and grow every year. And so it's in your best interest as a producer to take notes and take feedback. And I like to call them, you know, fresh eyes or good ideas that we, you know. And if you take a really intransigent approach to notes in general, you're not going to go very far in this business. But when you have different points of view and different audiences that you're trying to appeal to, hopefully you've set up the show where you're not in conflict from the get-go, where, you know, you have someone who's like, yeah, it's a science fiction show, Stephen King, but we want nothing scary. And you're like,
that could be a problem.
Which, you know, it was in terms of Haven, we ended up saying, look, Sci-Fi said, we don't want it to be too scary, so don't call it curses. I don't know if you've seen the show, but call it the Troubles. So we came up with this whole thing, and International was like, what? It's the Stephen King show. We want, like,
Curses.
Troubles. Well, it's an Irish thing. You'll figure it out. So basically,
Showcase, we don't care. We can go with scary.
They're sort of in
less
the middle.
scary.
Yeah, so
They're in the
it's sort of working a
dance,
dance and making everyone happy.
And that is so important early on,
Right.
that the broadcasters have those conversations to make sure that we're wanting to make the same show.
And from the broadcaster point of view, do you find it's better to just give your notes directly to the producers, or do you collaborate with the other networks first with your notes, or is there one particular way to approach that?
I hate to say it again, but it depends
It dep-
on the
no,
program.
that's fair.
And it depends on the people and the producers and how they want to work and what their relationships are, and also our relationship with the other broadcasters. I work on 6 out of 10 projects right now. Haven, we deal directly with E1 and Pillar CGN. Occasionally we talk to Sci-Fi, but we're all pretty much on the same page. Season 4, we're pretty comfortable. Whereas another show I do called Copper, we agreed with BBCA that we would give one set of unified notes, so we spent a lot of time talking broadcaster to broadcaster on that show. And both systems work.
And that's BBC America,
Yeah,
right?
BBC America, yeah.
And are there other broadcasters involved in that show who participate in the creative?
Mostly it's the two.
Most of
Yeah,
the two of them,
yeah.
mostly the two of them.
Yeah.
And what's your experience with that creative process and dealing with the different networks? I know, for example, Combat Hospital, if you want to...
Yes, we were the UK side of Combat Hospital,
Right.
which had lots of positives to it, but it was set up. One, it was very, very supportive, which I'll obviously tell Susan, very supportive Canadian broadcaster.
Global was the Canadian.
So it was, it had CMF funding, very important, so therefore it had a number of Canadian content, very important from CMF point of view that it was, it was a Canadian show. However, the ABC were a partner on this, and therefore there were a number of creative discussions about flags. And about, because it's all about Rolltree Hospital in the middle of Afghanistan, which is, with the conflict going on, it was horrible things going on. We were talking about whether the Canadian flag or the US flag was, how prevalent it was. And that, although trivial, it sort of goes to the heart of some of those issues. The other thing which can happen is where one of the broadcasters goes in one particular direction and another broadcaster goes in the other direction, the producer and the writers sometimes can divide and rule. That can be potentially disastrous because you have a very sort of unhappy sort of structure. So the key thing, I think, with any of these things is trying to get a shared vision and try and get partners who are likely, within certain parameters, are going to agree. If you don't do that, then there will be problems.
Yep, no, of course. And from a distributor point of view, you also look to have creative input as well?
Yes, that depends. So if we work with ZDF, for
Yep.
example, on an English-speaking production or an
Yes.
internationally appealing production, then that's a production that would be very important for us.
Yep.
And for ZDF, that is a program for their slot, so that's important for them as well. But it might happen that we might come in earlier because we might invest on our own risk.
Yes.
And try and place the show. And then in this period, when no broadcaster is attached, we are much more creatively
Yeah.
involved than
Yep.
if we have ZDF or
Yep.
we're currently doing a show with Sky Atlantic. If we have them involved right from the start, that changes the structure. To the question, if we work with a producer or the broadcaster, I also have to say that depends. It depends on simple things: who you know better,
Yep.
how long you know each other.
Yep. Trust.
Yes, there is always a certain level of trust, and there has to be in a co-production.
Yeah, that's right.
And you have to define that before every production, how intensely you want to or need to look at every single thing. But I would say that micromanaging from one side is never
Doesn't
really
really
works
work,
in a
yeah.
co-production.
You know, it is interesting, and I've been involved in a number of these, as you know. And the two things that are obviously true is, first of all, it's not just about a financial deal. Not every project should be a co-production. And even if you are able to get different partners involved, that doesn't necessarily, and it does mean great, you can finance your show, that could not necessarily be the best thing to do unless they really are on the same page with the vision. But even more importantly, that I find, even than the traditional show being developed by one network, when you're doing a co-production like this, it is so important that at the center of the show, there's a showrunner, be either a writer or an executive producer, who has a very, very clear vision of what they're going to do. Because, and is able to articulate that strongly and be able to make sure from the beginning that everyone knows what that is. Because unfortunately, that's not always true. Sometimes you have a show where you're in development, and remember, these are shows that are going right to series, so there is no pilot. It's, you know, there's a pilot script maybe, or 2 scripts. It's not completely clear what's all going to happen. But it really comes down to trust, because what I've found is if the networks really do trust that showrunner, and his vision is not only clear, but then he can execute that vision, for the most part, they're happy to let the showrunner go make his show. Network executives are very busy. They don't actually want to spend all this time writing pages and pages of notes and phone calls and watching cuts all the time and everything else. They would be just as happy to actually sit back and let you make your show as long as you really know what you're doing. The problems occur, of course, when that doesn't happen. And then the scripts are coming in late, and they're not good, and then it becomes a feeding frenzy because everybody wants to jump in and fix it because they all have a lot at stake, and that's when things go off the rails because, of course, different networks might have different ideas of how to fix it and what to do to make it better. So I just find in general, and please correct me or support me on this statement, that's so important because you can't, you know, having that creative vision and executing that vision, and then generally things go well. Yeah, and we've all seen the opposite.
Oh yeah, I was, my father, I grew up in this kind of television business. My father did a series of Star Trek shows, and I started writing for Star Trek, but he told me the most expensive haircut in the history of television was Catherine Janeway on Star Trek Voyager. Everybody at the studio at Paramount and internationally, it was the first female captain, and they all had a different idea on what her hair was going to look like. And they basically reshot the pilot, these first 4 scenes, like 10 times.
With a different
because
haircut each
no
time.
one could decide what her hair looked like, and it would go to someone else, and they're like, "No, we want it up." And then we tried that; it didn't look good. Well, and it was. So what I've learned a lot in terms of how to kind of with email and how to mass communicate. So you'll get at the beginning of the season, I get a lookbook, and I create a whole like costume, wear, hair, and makeup, and I just send it to everyone.
Yeah.
Here's your deadline. If you got any notes, get them in.
Yeah, especially with new characters,
Yep.
that's
Yep.
such a big thing.
And so it's really about finding out a way to efficiently communicate with everybody and have a central vision and take the notes quickly and creating a system where they feel like they can call you officially and say, we really don't like that hair or whatever, or unofficially, can you just, do, and so having that access and that openness and try to make it fun and try to make a good show. But there can definitely be challenges, for sure.